Imagine you are standing on the precipice of a global economic reset where every asset you own, your real estate, your diversified stock portfolio, and even your digital identity is suddenly liquidated by a force you cannot lobby, bribe, or litigate, leaving you shivering in the cold reality of your own spiritual insolvency. Because the man we are deconstructing today didn't just predict this collapse. He front-ran the entire system 800 years ago by shorting the world's elite to buy into a monopoly of the miraculous. Welcome back to the Awakened Seal. We are stepping into the arena of consciousness analysis to dissect a high-frequency spiritual operative known to history as Saint Anthony of Padua. But before he was a saint, he was Fernando de Bulhões, a high-born asset within the 1% of the 13th century Portuguese nobility, born into a family that didn't just have wealth, but held the keys to the geopolitical infrastructure of Lisbon. Yet he realized at a terrifyingly young age that he was living inside a sophisticated gilded cage, a simulation of power that required him to trade his eternal sovereignty for a temporary seat at the table of the decaying elite. In this analysis, we aren't looking at a pious fairy tale. We are looking at a masterclass in social survival and systemic exit strategies. Because Fernando saw the inflation of the ego and the devaluation of the soul long before the modern central banks began printing their way to oblivion. And his decision to walk away from his inheritance was the ultimate act of spiritual arbitrage. Born in 1195, right under the shadow of the Lisbon Cathedral, Fernando was groomed for the high-stakes game of church and state. A world where the sword and the cross were often the same instrument of control. His parents, Martin and Maria Teresa, represented the pinnacle of the social hierarchy, ensuring he received the most advanced education in theology and the arts of the ruling class. But Fernando possessed a cognitive anomaly, a prodigious memory, and an analytical depth that allowed him to see through the social contracts of his time, finding more utility in the silent patterns of the Psalms than in the loud, empty theater of the court. While his peers were busy diversifying their political alliances, Fernando was performing a deep-tissue scan of his own psyche, realizing that the luxury surrounding him was a form of debt that would eventually be called in by the Reaper. So at the age of 15, an age when most young men are obsessed with status and sexual conquest, he executed a radical divestment by entering the monastery of São Vicente de Fora, which was essentially his first attempt to go dark and escape the surveillance of his noble family. This wasn't just a religious whim, it was a tactical withdrawal from a system he found intellectually and spiritually bankrupt. Yet even behind monastery walls, his family's influence pursued him like a persistent algorithm, their frequent visits and promises of a brilliant career acting as a form of social malware trying to reinstall his old identity, forcing him to make an even more aggressive move by requesting a transfer to the monastery of Santa Cruz in Coimbra, a distance great enough to break the tether of his old life and allow him to immerse himself in the deep data archives of the Augustinian order. For 8 years, Fernando functioned as a human supercomputer, absorbing the entirety of the era's theological and philosophical output, building a mental architecture so robust that it could later withstand the most sophisticated intellectual attacks from the Cathar heretics. But the universe was about to throw a black swan event into his path in the form of 5 mangled bodies, the Franciscan martyrs returning from Morocco, whose deaths acted as a catalyst that shattered his academic isolation. Seeing those relics was a moment of absolute cognitive dissonance for him, as he realized that all his accumulated knowledge was useless if it wasn't backed by the ultimate skin in the game, which is the willingness to sacrifice the physical vessel for the sake of the truth. So he performed his final and most devastating pivot. He shed the prestigious Augustinian habit, changed his name to Anthony to erase the last traces of Fernando, and joined the Franciscans, an order that at the time was the equivalent of a radical anti-establishment startup focused on extreme poverty and grassroots disruption. This was a total liquidation of his intellectual and social capital, a move that would be seen today as a CEO of a Fortune 500 company resigning to live in a tent city. But Anthony understood that in the economy of the spirit, you have to be empty to be filled. and he immediately sought the most dangerous market available: Morocco, the front line of the clash of civilizations, where he hoped to achieve martyrdom and end his earthly contract in a blaze of glory. However, the simulation had other plans. A severe illness incapacitated him upon arrival, proving that even the most determined operative cannot force the hand of the divine architect. And as he tried to return to Portugal, a violent storm, a literal geopolitical redirection, blew his ship to the shores of Sicily, landing him in the middle of a chaotic, fragmented Italy that was the epicenter of the world's emerging banking systems and political intrigue. Anthony, now a sick anonymous friar with no rank and no pedigree, crawled his way to the general chapter in Assisi, where he sat among thousands of other brothers, a silent titan hiding in plain sight, eventually being assigned to a remote hermitage in Monte Paolo, where he spent his days washing dishes and sweeping floors, a period of low-power mode that allowed him to integrate his immense learning with a new level of profound humility. This was the calm before the storm, the period where he waited for the specific market conditions that would require his unique set of skills. And that moment arrived at an ordination in Forlì in 1222, when through a series of administrative failures, no preacher was prepared to speak, and Anthony was pushed to the podium as a last resort, expecting to provide a few simple, pious platitudes. But what came out was a sonic boom of intellectual and spiritual power that leveled the room. He didn't just speak. He performed a live deconstruction of the scriptures with such precision and fire that the Dominicans, the academic elite of the day, were left speechless, realizing that they were in the presence of a once-in-a-generation intellect that had been forged in the fires of silence and suffering. This event was his IPO, his public launch, and from that moment on, Anthony became the church's most lethal weapon against the rising tides of heresy and social injustice, moving through the cities of Italy and France like a high-velocity disruptor who could speak to the illiterate peasant and the corrupt magistrate with equal authority. He understood that the heresies of his time, like the Cathars and Albigensians, weren't just theological errors, but social symptoms of a world that had become disconnected from the raw reality of the Incarnation, and he used his gift of preaching not to entertain, but to perform a mass psychological recalibration of the populace. His style was incisive. It was the awakened seal before the term existed, a voice that cut through the noise of the medieval marketplace to address the fundamental anxiety of the human condition, warning the wealthy that their hoarded gold would become the very shackles that dragged them into the abyss, and reminding the poor that their suffering was a temporary state in a much larger, more complex, cosmic game. As his fame scaled exponentially, the miracles began to manifest, not as cheap magic tricks, but as fundamental glitches in the material matrix that proved his alignment with the source code of reality, such as the time in Rimini when the people were so blinded by their own ideological biases that they refused to listen to him. So he turned to the Adriatic Sea and commanded the fish to rise and hear the word of God, a moment that shattered the local reality tunnel and forced the city to confront the fact that even the irrational creatures recognized the truth that the rational humans were too proud to see. This wasn't just a miracle, it was a demonstration of universal hierarchy, a reminder that the environment itself is a stakeholder in the truth, and it served as a terrifying warning to those who think they can ignore the laws of nature and spirit without consequence. Anthony's battle wasn't just against abstract ideas, it was against the predatory economic systems of the 13th century, particularly the usurers who were the payday lenders of their day, trapping the vulnerable in cycles of debt that lasted for generations. And he used his platform to demand systemic reform, eventually influencing the legislation of Padua to protect the insolvent, an early form of consumer protection that showed he understood the intersection of spiritual health and economic justice. He was a survival expert who knew that you couldn't have a stable society if the foundation was built on the exploitation of the weak, and his sermons were often red pill moments for the elite, forcing them to look into the eyes of the people they were destroying and see the face of the judge who awaited them. Each step of his journey, from the palaces of Lisbon to the dusty roads of Padua, was a calculated move in a grand strategy of liberation, a refusal to accept the default settings of his era, and a commitment to building a legacy that wouldn't rust or be stolen by the passage of time. He was a man who lived in a state of constant hyper-awareness, a preacher who could sense the hidden sins of his listeners and bring them to light not to shame them, but to offer them an exit ramp from their own self-destruction. And as we analyze the first half of his meteoric rise, we must ask ourselves, what are the palaces we are refusing to leave, and what are the fish we are ignoring while the world burns around us? Anthony's life is a blueprint for the ultimate exit, a guide for anyone who realizes that the system they were born into is a trap, and that the only way to truly win is to change the parameters of the game entirely. Because as he moved closer to his final days, the miracles didn't just increase in frequency. They increased in their challenge to the very fabric of our understanding of time, space, and identity. We are just scratching the surface of this operative's file, and as we prepare to look at the second phase of his mission, where he confronts the real presence of the divine in the most physical and shocking ways, you have to decide if you are ready to see the world for what it really is, or if you want to stay asleep in your comfortable, devaluing simulation. The story of Anthony isn't about the past. It's about the urgent present. A warning to every soul that the window for divestment is closing, and the time to invest in the eternal is right now, before the final bell of the market rings and the accounts are settled once and for all. Stay tuned, because what happens when this man, who has mastered the art of being nothing, finally comes face to face with the child who is everything, will not only change your perspective on history, it will make your very skin crawl with the realization of the power that is currently dormant within you, waiting for the right moment to be awakened. And in the next part of this deep dive, we will explore the terrifying beauty of his final miracles, the secret behind his gift of tongues that allowed him to bypass any linguistic firewall, and the ultimate prophecy of his death that proved he was already living in the future while the rest of the world was stuck in the dark. Do I have your permission to proceed to part 2, where we unlock the final seals of this miraculous legacy? If you think the laws of physics are an unbreakable contract, then you are still living in the basement of the simulation, because the man we are deconstructing today didn't just bend the rules, he rewrote the source code of reality in front of thousands of witnesses who were forced to watch as their rational world collapsed into a singular point of divine authority. So buckle up as we peel back the final layers of the operative known as Anthony of Padua, to reveal the terrifying efficiency of a soul that has achieved total liquidity within the matrix of the miraculous. Welcome back to the Awakened Seal. We are picking up the frequency in the city of Toulouse, a stronghold of Catharism where the intellectual elite had built a fortress of skepticism against the doctrine of the real presence. And it is here that Anthony encountered the archetype of the modern rationalist, a man named Bonovillo, who believed that matter and spirit were permanently decoupled and that the Eucharist was nothing more than a symbolic relic of a dead tradition. But Anthony understood that the divine is not a metaphor, but a high-frequency intrusion into the physical plane. So he accepted a challenge that would serve as the ultimate stress test for the materialist worldview. A 3-day fast for a mule followed by a public confrontation where the animal would have to choose between its survival instinct and the resonance of the Creator. Imagine the tension in that square, a microcosm of the global conflict between the visible and the invisible, where the crowd stood as the ultimate jury of a reality trial, as Bonovillo presented a bucket of fragrant oats to a starving beast, while Anthony held a simple piece of consecrated bread, a scenario that should have been a slam dunk for the materialist cause. But what happened next was a total system failure for the skeptical mind, because the mule, driven by an impulse that bypassed its own biological programming, ignored the life-sustaining grain and knelt in a profound gesture of geometric submission before the Blessed Sacrament, proving that even the irrational creatures possess a sensor for the frequency of the divine that modern, rational humans have successfully jammed with the white noise of consumerism and ego. This was not a magic trick. It was a demonstration of a higher hierarchy, a reminder that the very atoms of the universe are in a state of constant, humble acknowledgement of the source, and it left the skeptics in a state of cognitive ruin, forcing them to realize that their logic was merely a local variable in a much larger cosmic equation. But Anthony's intervention in the social fabric didn't stop at theological disputes. He moved into the domestic sphere in Ferrara to resolve a high-stakes crisis of jealousy where a newborn's legitimacy was being weaponized by a husband's irrational suspicion, a situation that threatened to destroy a family and exile an innocent woman. Yet Anthony didn't resort to mediation or counseling. He performed a direct hack on the biological timeline by commanding a days-old infant to speak, an event that broke every linguistic and physiological protocol known to man. When that child sat up and clearly identified his father, it wasn't just a miracle of speech. It was the restoration of truth in its most raw, undeniable form, a warning that the truth cannot be buried under the layers of human insecurity or social gossip, and it served as a terrifying reminder that there is a witness to every hidden thought and every private injustice. We must analyze this as the ultimate form of social engineering, where the saint uses his access to the divine backdoor to fix a broken social contract, proving that a single point of absolute truth can recalibrate an entire community's moral compass. As we move deeper into the data, we encounter the phenomenon of bilocation, the ultimate productivity hack for a soul that has transcended the limitations of three-dimensional space. Specifically in Montpellier, where Anthony was simultaneously leading a choir in his monastery and delivering a high-impact sermon in a cathedral miles away, a feat that suggests he had mastered the art of multi-threading his own consciousness. From a consciousness analysis perspective, this is the proof that the self is not localized in the body, but is a non-local field of influence that can manifest in multiple nodes of the network at once, and it reached its peak when he appeared in Lisbon to defend his father against a false murder charge while he was physically in Italy, literally pausing his sermon in the middle of a sentence to teleport his presence across a continent to intervene in a court of law. This is the ultimate high-frequency trading of the soul, where the speed of light is irrelevant compared to the speed of grace, and it demonstrates that for the fully awakened entity, the global map is just a small, navigable folder on a much larger desktop. But perhaps his most radical intervention was his macroeconomic war against usury in Padua, where the financial elite had created a debt trap that was suffocating the common people, leading Anthony to launch a series of economic exorcisms from the pulpit that targeted the very heart of the predatory lending system. He wasn't just preaching about kindness. He was dismantling a corrupt financial architecture, eventually forcing the passage of the Antonine Statutes, which were the 13th century version of a debt jubilee and bankruptcy protection law, proving that spiritual power is the only force capable of breaking the grip of systemic greed. He confronted the usurers with such terrifying clarity about their eternal prospects that their profit and loss statements suddenly looked like death warrants, leading many to liquidate their ill-gotten gains and return them to the poor, a market correction of unprecedented scale that showed Anthony was the ultimate sovereign individual who could not be bought, intimidated, or silenced by the powers of the world. And then there is the gift of tongues, the restoration of a pre-Babel communication protocol where every person in a multilingual crowd heard him in their own native language, a phenomenon that bypassed the linguistic firewalls of the human brain and spoke directly to the heart's internal operating system. This was the ultimate universal translator, a sign that the truth is a frequency that transcends culture, dialect, and education, and it allowed him to scale his influence at a rate that would be impossible for any modern influencer, even with the help of a billion-dollar algorithm. But as the mission reached its final stage, we see Anthony retreating to a walnut tree in Campo San Piero, seeking a literal high-altitude transmission point for his final prayers, where he experienced a vision of the child Jesus that was so tangible it became the permanent watermark of his identity in history. This vision was the ultimate dividend, the final payout for a life that had been entirely invested in the unseen, and as he felt his physical hardware failing at the age of 36, he didn't fear the exit. He welcomed it as the final step of a long-planned divestment strategy from the mortal plane. His final words, "I see my Lord," were the confirmation of a successful transition, a signal that he had successfully uploaded his consciousness to the eternal server, and the moment his soul left the body, the children of Padua began to cry out in the streets without any human messenger telling them the news, proving that his death was a planetary-scale event that resonated through the collective unconscious. Even after his unplugging, the miracles didn't stop. They only accelerated, with his tomb becoming a high-energy portal where the blind saw, the lame walked, and the lost were found, not just in terms of material objects, but in terms of their very purpose and direction in life. The tradition of St. Anthony's bread for the poor is the ongoing fiscal policy of his legacy, a perpetual endowment that ensures his concern for economic justice continues to feed the hungry centuries after his departure, and his role as the patron of lost objects is actually a sophisticated psychological service for a humanity that has lost its way in the fog of the material matrix. When you invoke him to find a lost key or a lost document, you are actually tapping into the network of an entity that specializes in asset recovery for the soul, helping you find the pieces of your own identity that have been stolen by the distractions of the world. We are looking at a legacy that has survived every empire, every economic collapse, and every technological revolution of the last 800 years, a testament to the fact that when you build your life on the bedrock of the miraculous, you become part of an infrastructure that is immune to the passage of time. So as we close this file, you have to ask yourself, are you still trying to protect your crumbling assets in a world that is designed to take them from you? Or are you ready to follow the blueprint of the noble of Lisbon, who became the saint of the world by realizing that the only way to keep your soul is to give it away entirely? Anthony of Padua was not just a man of the past. He is a persistent presence in the grid, a reminder that the miraculous is simply the natural state of a human being who has stopped lying to themselves about the nature of reality. The Awakened Seal is not just a title for a video, it is the state of being that Anthony reached, a point of total clarity where the barriers between the divine and the human have been permanently dissolved, and his life remains the ultimate red pill for anyone who is brave enough to swallow it and see how deep the rabbit hole of grace really goes. The accounts are settled, the evidence is in, and the choice is yours. Will you continue to play the small, losing game of the materialists? Or will you step into the vast, terrifyingly beautiful economy of the saints, where the only currency that matters is the love that you were willing to risk everything for? This has been a deep dive into the frequency of the miraculous, a journey through the life of a man who proved that one soul, fully aligned with the truth, can move the mountains of history and change the destiny of billions. So as you go back into your world, remember that you are carrying the same potential for awakening within your own code. If only you have the courage to execute the final divestment and claim your seat in the kingdom that has no end. Goodbye for now, but keep your eyes on the seals, because they are breaking one by one, and only the awakened will know how to read the signs of the times.